Καλησπέρα. Καλώς ήρθατε στην δεύτερη ενότητα αφιερωμένη στο θέμα πολιτικές ταυτότητες. The discussion today is going to be in English. However, our discussions, our speakers would be able to respond, to take your questions in either language. So I would like to welcome Vassilis, Lambropoulos, Peter Bratsis, and Despina Papadimitriou. And since I assume you all hear me, if you don't mind, just sort of like follow a chronological order based on the content of your talks. Again, if you don't mind, if Despina would like to go first, Vassilis second, and Peter third, would you all agree? Despina? Would that be okay? Can you hear us?
Ναι.
Okay.
Μας ψιλοπιέζουν να πάμε φέτος. Είμαστε όλοι, δηλαδή, ένας συνάδελφος μόνο που είχε κάποιον λόγο.
Δεν σε ακούμε πολύ καλά. We can't hear you very well.
Νομίζω κάποια μαθήματα τα κάνει. Όλοι πάμε πια.
Αν μην είναι εμβολιασμένοι και προσέχουν.
Μπορείς ξανά να... Δεν σε ακούμε.
Στο σούπερ μάρκετ πάνε όλοι. Να βγουν έξω, βγαίνουν.
Να.
Δεν ακούγεται καλά.
Τώρα, σε εμάς που είμαστε τώρα και μικρότερο πανεπιστήμιο.
Okay, better. Δέσποινα, μας ακούς?
Ναι.
Okay. Δεν ακούγεσαι όμως πολύ καλά και ανησυχώ αν θα ακούσουμε καθαρά την ομιλία σου.
Δέσποινα, εγώ.
Ναι.
Δεν ακούγομαι τώρα.
Εντάξει, τώρα καλύτερα, πολύ καλύτερα. Μια χαρά. Okay.
Εντάξει.
Κοίτα,
έχω κάποιες...
Ρώταγα αν δεν σε πειράζει να ξεκινήσεις εσύ, να συνεχίσει ο Βασίλης και μετά ο Πίτερ.
Δεν ξέρω...
Δέσποινα, μήπως αυτό μπερδέψει τον κόσμο, ο οποίος έχει στο νου του τη σειρά του προγράμματος.
Τέλος πάντων, δεν είναι τόσο σημαντικό. Απλώς επειδή το περιεχόμενο των ομιλιών σας έτσι κάπως χρονολογικά θα έβγαινε πιο... Αλλά δεν έχει τόσο μεγάλη σημασία.
Ας το κάνουμε έτσι.
Δεν έχει πολύ μεγάλη σημασία.
Το ανέφερα.
Δεν πειράζει.
Εγώ δεν έχω κανένα πρόβλημα. Είναι αλήθεια ότι μπορεί κάποιος που θα ήθελε ας πούμε, να ακούσει επί παραδείγματι τον κύριο Λαμπρόπουλο να συνδεθεί μετά. Είναι
Ακριβώς.
Αλήθεια ότι...
Ναι, δεν το σκέφτηκα. Okay, so in this case, let's go follow the program. Let me introduce Vassilis Lambropoulos, who will be our first speaker, who is the Cavafy Professor Emeritus of Classical Studies and Comparative Literature at the University of Michigan. His main research interests are modern Greek culture, classical reception and the classic, civic ethics and democratic politics, tragedy and the tragic, word, poetry and music. His authored books are Literature as National Institution, The Rise of Eurocentrism, and The Tragic Idea. He has co-edited the volumes The Text and Its Margins and 20th Century Literary Theory, and 2 special issues of academic journals on the humanities and social technology, and ethical politics in the South Atlantic Quarterly. So he has been publishing papers, essays, articles, reviews, and translations in journals, periodicals, and newspapers, and he has been serving on the editorial board of several international journals. He explores the notion of revolution as hubris in modern tragedy in the site in progress, The Tragedy of a Revolution. That's an online project. And he blogs on music, literature, France, and resistance at Piano Poetry, Pantelis Politics. I will introduce Peter and Despina later on. So, Vassilis, whenever you're ready, we are listening.
All right. Thank you, Despina, for inviting me to this panel. Congratulations to the collective for this Herculean task that has been so successful. And I have 5 pages to read, which I think you will find quite interesting because I'm telling a story or two. In the late 1950s, the Karamanlis government was heavily promoting Greece as a unique tourist destination. As part of the campaign for the branding of cultural heritage, Karamanlis invited the master planner and coordinator of Sound and Light to put together on the Acropolis a dazzling show that would impress the new masses of tourists visiting the country. Sound and Light, Son and Lumiere, was an innovative French spectacle offering history as entertainment, created and installed by the private French company by the same name, Sound and Light, which took home a significant percentage of the profits. First presented in French castles in 1951 to 53, it was then from the late 50s to the first decade of the 21st century exported to Athens and 3 other Greek sites, as well as to numerous popular archaeological destinations in Italy, England, Egypt, India, and the USA. At a time when Greece was fostering European investment to expedite the country's admission to the common market 2 years later in 1961, and France was developing a variety of economic interests in Greece, the Athenian Sound and Light show, the largest and most expensive of its kind, had the support of both governments, the Greek and the French, and became very popular. It ceased to operate in 2000 after 41 years of continuous operation during the tourist season between March and September. The audience of the show sat on the Pnyx Hill, facing the Acropolis, and listened to the archetypal story of the defeat of the barbaric Persians by the glorious Greeks, narrated to the accompaniment of brilliant lights and original music. There was no acting, it was just light and sound. The monuments of the Acropolis were transformed into a transhistorical symbol of beauty and freedom under the prestigious French cultural patronage with a veneer of civilizing mission abroad. The opening ceremony included, in 1959 that is, included official military patronage as well. 21 French warships and 2,500 naval officers, French naval officers, who marched through the streets of Athens to the Pnyx, participated in a display of military might. Presented as a, quote, celebration of Franco-Greek friendship, it was attended by the Greek royal family, Prime Minister Karamanlis, members of the Greek government, and distinguished international guests. Now, the speaker of the solemn occasion was a towering intellectual figure and a great admirer of things Greek, André Malraux, Minister of State with responsibility for cultural affairs. His speech, Homage to Greece, like the narrative of the spectacle, revolved around the basic theme of West freedom culture versus East tyranny barbarism, a topic which, in light of a Spenglerian decline of the West, fascinated Malraux since his first book, The Temptation of the Occident, in 1926. The speech invoked as exemplary Greek figures goddess Athena, who first combined the spear and thought, as well as Aeschylus and Sophocles, who were both artists and, Malraux called them, combatants. And also the speech challenged, quote, all the Western youth to remember when for the first time man put in the service of the spirit the spears that stopped Xerxes. The Greek right-wing establishment, which had been alarmed by the remarkable rise of the left in the national elections a year earlier, in 1958, barely 9 years after the end of the Civil War, certainly identified Eastern barbarism with a communist threat. The launching of the Southern Light spectacle had behind it half a century of intense French Hellenism. In France, and I'm quoting here Henri Peyret, in France, never, even during the Renaissance, was there such an obsession with the themes of Hellenic mythology or of Platonic imaginative thought, such a sincere and enriching admiration for Greek drama, such an enlightened appreciation of Greek architecture and sculpture as have been witnessed in the last 50 years, from 1900 to 1950. Claudel, Gide, Valéry, Maurras, Giraudoux, Cocteau, Anouilh, Sartre, Molyneux, Thibaudet, Camus are only some of the French thinkers and authors from that period who incorporated Hellenic ideals in their work. As Malraux put it in his speech, quote, "A secret Greece rests in the heart of all the men of the West." But during the late 1950s, the ideal of Hellas was also mobilized to defend the French prestige that had been tarnished by colonial unrest, as international opinion had turned against France's colonial mission in Northern Africa during the Algerian War of Independence, which had started in 1954. And I'm quoting Malraux here, "France's desire to put its official governmental stamp on the Athenian Sound and Light show can perhaps be read as an attempt to bolster international goodwill and improve its image abroad, particularly in terms of its relations in the Mediterranean. The Sound and Light show allowed France to dress itself up in the guise of benevolent cultural patron." This brings us to the colonial uses of Hellas, which is at the center of this symposium. Algeria is a fascinating example of the role that reception of classics can play in colonial cultures. This reception has served different functions, and I'm quoting here Luke Richardson. "In the literature of the French Algeria, there was a long tradition of using classical motifs both to justify colonialism and later to integrate the European and non-European populations of Algeria. Propagandistic appropriations of the Greeks and the Romans by Algerian colonialists illustrate how essential the discourse of classicism was to European imperialism. Here we can mention two classical appropriations, Algerianism and Mediterraneanism, which stood in opposition to each other. The school of Algerianism was focusing on Rome, on the Latin world. It sought to promote a Franco-Algerian nationality that was culturally equal to metropolitan France. In time, this identity would also be stressed as culturally superior to the Arab population and was based on the presence of France in Africa as an absolute right founded in pre-existent Roman presence. And people here would point to Roman ruins in Algeria and say, so this is not colonialism, this is Western presence here since antiquity. The school of Mediterraneanism, the other one, confronted Algerianism by presenting the modern Mediterranean as descended from ancient Greece, not Rome. Quote, "The Mediterranean acted as a reclamation of classical culture, which was being used elsewhere to justify imperialism and oppression." If Roman Mediterraneanism was military, fascist, and so on, Mediterraneanism was the assumption was Greek and democratic and egalitarian. But this school too, the Mediterranean one, ignored the Arab and the so-called Berber culture. Both schools used the ancient culture to marginalize the people over whom they ruled in Algeria. We can now place this inauguration, the 1951 inauguration, of this totally ethereal Hellas, all pure sound and light bathing the Acropolis in a broader context. At a time of diminished cultural prestige and military might, the French culture, industry, and army appealed to Hellas to show that they remained eminent and powerful. They drew lines of connection between themselves and ancient Greece to suggest that, like the Greeks, they too were fighting the barbaric East by trying to quell the Algerian revolt, which threatened the classical values that Malraux called culture and courage. Standing on the side of the ancient assembly on the Pnyx, Malraux, who once had been a critic of French colonial authorities, but as a Gaullist minister defended the government policy in Algeria and failed to protest the torture of the French army, invoked democracy and declared an unwavering French commitment to Western civilization, symbolized by Hellas. Now we'll move on to, incidentally, in the year 2004, when just ahead of the, before the Olympic Games, the Greeks decide that it's time to relit the Acropolis. They again go to the French, they go to the person who had organized the Eiffel Tower spectacle, the Millennium spectacle, and ask him to come in 2004, just months before the Olympics, to light again the Acropolis. But we go now to 2017. Almost 60 years since Malraux spoke at the Pnyx, in the very same place, another French politician reiterated the very same commitment during another Western crisis, this time a political as well as spiritual crisis. In September 2017, President Emmanuel Macron, again in the dramatic setting of the Pnyx, gave a major policy speech on the future of Europe, outlining a new vision for the continent. Since Greece was the symbol of the European crisis at that time, he went to Greece to talk about overcoming that crisis. He said, everything that has held us together for decades is coming apart. And he sought to position himself as the leader to fix European Union's crisis of confidence, calling for the shoring up of the shared European values of sovereignty, democracy, and culture. Like Malraux, Macron is also talking European universal cultures. He said, Europe is one of the last havens where we collectively continue to harbor a certain idea of humanity, law, freedom, and justice. We need Europe now more than ever. The world needs Europe, says Macron at the Pnyx. And here is his understanding of Hellas, quoting Macron. Yes, the Acropolis of Athens is a mirror reflecting our European identity. We recognize ourselves. We read our common destiny in this mirror, and this temple was that of the gods from antiquity. But today, the beliefs that created it have vanished, and yet we still have this force in our minds. We can still feel its sacred element. As André Malraux said, this is Macron in 2017, quoting Malraux, there is a hidden Greece that is lying in the hearts of all men and women of the Western world. Thus, Hellas and France remained mutually authenticating. The similarities with the inauguration did not end here and included a strong financial component, as they did back in 1959. Macron flew with a retinue of business people representing more than 40 companies, including 10 CEOs. As France had signaled that it is keen to invest in infrastructure, energy, construction, and the service sector, his visit focused on the sale of state assets launched by the Syriza government of Alexis Tsipras. Malraux is quoted once again by Lina Mendoni, the Greek Minister of Culture in 2020, when the Onassis Foundation is now sponsoring the relighting of the Acropolis, but we'll skip that and we will conclude with this September, only 2 months ago. In September 2021, Malraux was quoted once again, this time by Prime Minister Mitsotakis, who went to the Élysée Palace to sign with Macron the Strategic Partnership Agreement for Cooperation in Defense and Security between Greece and France, whereby Greece once again bought French technology, meaning 6 fighter jets and 3 warships that continue the military patronage of Hellas launched in 1959. Mitsotakis in his speech quoted the by now familiar phrase, "A secret Greece rests in the heart of all the men in the West." And as he put it, quoting Mitsotakis now, quoting Mitsotakis speaking to Macron, civilization could not exist without the foundation set by ancient Greek thought, but civilization could not have grown either without the fertile winds of the French Enlightenment. And I conclude. By looking at the glorification of transhistorical Hellas at the 1959 inauguration of Sound and Light and its subsequent reverberations and refractions, we can see multiple colonial claims on Hellas made on behalf of France, Greece, the Mediterranean, the West, civilization, whiteness, military might, you name it. And yet no one has noticed that there seems to be something that colonialist Hellas cannot silence. It is an Eastern incantation that we hear at the very end of Malraux's speech as he is addressing himself to the lights that are for the first time illuminating the Acropolis, the sound and light lights. And Malraux concludes like this in his, pompous way. "O radiant lights of this night, go and tell the world that Thermopylae is summoning Salamis and will finish its call with the Acropolis, if only we forget them not. And may the world, beneath the Panathenaeans, never lose remembrance of the mighty procession with the dead of olden days and of yesterday, their solemn guard ascending in the night, their soundless message arising, reaching us united for the first time into the most ancient incantation of the East." And Malraux quotes, "And if this is a night of destiny, blessed be the night up until the coming of the new dawn." Where does this mysterious concluding quote come from? Malraux did not give his source, but a Muslim Algerian fighting for his country's destiny would easily recognize it. The quote refers to the night of destiny or power, which to Muslims is the holiest day of the year, when the holy book was sent from heaven to the world. If Ernest Renan prayed to God If Ernest Renan prayed to Goddess Athena, did Malraux pray to Allah? The grave Panathenian procession ascending the sacred rock through the centuries is sending us its silent message in the language of the oldest Eastern incantation from the Quran. Might these united tidings be the secret Greece that rests in the heart of all the men in the West? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vassili. Ευχαριστούμε. Να συνεχίσουμε με τον Peter Bratsis, ο οποίος είναι who is the Associate Professor of Political Science at the City University of New York and has authored and co-authored a couple of different books, Everyday Life and the State, and with recently deceased Stanley Aronovitch, Paradigm Lost, State Theory Reconsidered. He's also the author of a number of articles in peer-reviewed journals, collective volumes, but also newspapers and magazines. His research mainly concerns the categories and ideas that our political world is based upon and how these ideas are created and reproduced. This has included studies on the production of the state, the categories of the public and private, the ways that nationalized individuals are created, and the perception of the clean and dirty in political life. Current projects include a book by the title An Anatomy of Corruption, Nationalist Desire and Imperialist Ideology in the Age of Globalization. Peter, we are listening.
Thank you, Despina. And thank you for inviting me to the panel. I'm very happy to be here and to be speaking also on the panel with Vassilis and Despina. I'm going to focus on two issues that I think have been particularly relevant to Greece in the context of contemporary imperial or colonial projects. The question of corruption, of course, and the anti-corruption movement that has been in existence from around 1993 onwards, and the question of the increasing disembeddedness or authoritarian character of the capitalist state, and how both have been manifest in Greek politics. To begin with, I think if there is any contemporary imagining of the world that reproduces the traditional colonial viewpoint, it is that of corruption. If you look to the various maps that are produced by Transparency International, by the Opacity Index and a number of other organizations, you will see a map of the world that very, very closely corresponds to the colonial and racist imagining of the world. The southern part of the world, Africa, much of Asia, of course, South America and so forth, is in the darker colors, indicating more corrupt, of course, more corrupt. And the lighter colors, which are in the north, North America, northern parts of Europe and so forth, are in a very light color. Now, this way of conceiving of the world as more prone to corrupt or less to corrupt has a number of functions. To begin with, it is a way of justifying the relative fortunes of these different regions of the world. That Africa is poor is not to be understood as a product of colonialism, as a product of the world system or any other way. It is to be understood as a self-created and unfortunate situation that the corruption among these peoples have doomed them to a life of poverty and lack of economic development. For example, there's Susan Rose Ackerman, who's a professor at Yale, has written many books on this, has a book precisely on this question. And she asks, you know, how can it be that Africa, that is so wealthy in terms of natural resources, can be so poor? And her conclusion is, well, obviously it's because they are living under these corrupt regimes, which squander wealth, which inhibit economic development and doom them to poverty. It also, of course, functions as a justification for foreign intervention. That because these places are not capable by themselves of securing the conditions for economic development, for securing the conditions for proper governance or an efficient state functioning, there has to be some kind of intervention from the outside, whether that be the World Bank, whether that be the IMF or any other kind of international agency. Now, Greece, of course, has featured prominently in this context because it has been Greece that has been understood as by far the most corrupt of all the countries of the European Union, usually by a very wide difference compared to, let's say, Italy or Portugal, or some of the other, a bit above average in terms of corruption, but not, of course, on the level of Greece. This has functioned. Now this doesn't come from out of nowhere, obviously, because the index on corruption is based on a survey of business people and country experts as to how corrupt they perceive these various places to be. So the index, or the various indices produced on corruption, are a measure of surveys of people who view Greece or Italy or Egypt or China, what have you, how corrupt they might be. And it's not surprising, of course, given this, that Greece consistently ranks as among the most corrupt. These, as I mentioned before, these programs begin in 1993. They have expanded and become more intense since then. And I think in terms of its ideological mission, we have to conclude they have been extremely successful. That it is almost gospel today that economic development follows from or is inhibited by corruption, that high levels of corruption equal low levels of economic development. And if Greece has economic problems, for example, if there is a debt crisis or there are severe economic problems within Greece, it is best understood as a product of their corruption. And of course, George Papandreou said this in very direct ways when he was prime minister. Pangalos, of course, very famously with the phrase that "ta fagame mazi," we all ate it together. You know, now don't blame who you're going to blame. Blame yourself because you know you were the ones, the pigs who ate from the trough of public finance. And the same is true globally. Even I've been to conferences where you have discussions with these economists and people on the other side, and you point out that the two countries with the highest levels of economic growth in the last 30, 40, 50 years, India and China, are two of the most presumably corrupt countries of the world. So if it is in fact the case that is corruption that creates poverty, how do you explain the immense economic development in China and India? And even such a simple and direct example of how this discourse, how this ideology is limited, is not enough to shake them from their certainty that any lack of development is primarily a product of political corruption. Together with this ideological function of the corruption discourse that, again, reproduces the older discourse on the white man's burden of a kind of racialized hierarchy. But instead of now biology or genetics, it's a question of the different people's tendencies towards corruption. Is also a recasting of what corruption means. Because now, as even the name of these organizations indicate, it becomes mainly about the ability to see, transparency. And whose ability to see? Primarily the ability of investors or transnational capital, we could say, to be able to understand and calculate the various costs and benefits involved in their investments. You know, if you invest in Greece, what are the expected taxes and limitations and regulations one has to deal with? And the idea that any kind of informality, any lack of strict bureaucratic procedures, anything that is unexpected, unpredictable, And in fact, any kind of social embeddedness of political institutions becomes a source of corruption. So in addition to pushing for a certain understanding of the world that sees its various regions and parts as a continuum of propensity towards corruption, and the poor parts being much, the ones that are the most corrupt, and the more wealthy, those that are the least corrupt, it also is an attempt to transform the nation state, the capitalist state, in ways that make it less embedded within the societies in which they find themselves. And I think, again, here, Greece plays a very significant role, because Greece, of course, in particular, has had links in terms of its procedures of political legitimation and reproduction that are oftentimes quite informal and have been extremely embedded within society. Clientelism, of course, most notably. The fact that in Greece, there was this informal system of privileges and favors that were done through these clientelist networks was a significant source of not only party stability and discipline in terms of its supporters, but also was a way for common people to get a piece, let's say, of public wealth, a piece of those resources that could be redistributed towards the bottom. Now, it's not mainly necessarily because of the anti-corruption movement that this system has largely broken down. It's in many ways because of the financial limitations that the Greek state faces, where it's no longer possible to hand out much of what it used to in the form of favors to the patrons of the various political groups. But it points to this tendency of states becoming ever more disembedded from social movements, from society. And it mirrors, of course, the increasing disembeddedness of capital from place. Greece, again, was always a bit out of the norm in terms of Europe, at least, because the main capitalist enterprises in Greece were largely what has been termed by Nikos Pouladras and others, comprador capitalism, which is to say, Greece served as a kind of staging post in the global circuit of capital, but it was not, Greece in itself was not of any great importance. The domestic markets weren't of any great importance. Internal developments weren't of any great consequence. Capital flowed through. So, of course, industries like shipping, tourism, mining, banking, they may have been stationed in Greece in some ways, had some connections to Greece, but the ship owners, and this year, of course, there was the famous incident in the interview with Panos Laskaridis, who said, and I paraphrase, the ship owners shit on the prime minister. We don't need the prime minister. We don't need the Greek state. They need us, which is, of course, not inaccurate. Is unusually honest. So this increase, and this has been true in Greece for a long time, but this has become even more true, of course, in recent times, especially in the context of the debt crisis. So on the one hand, the anti-corruption movements. On the other hand, the already quite weak position Greece was in terms of its position within the global capitalist system, how it had little leverage to gain concessions from capital, to impose some kinds of limitations on the movements of capital, or on the how embedded capital was within Greece, have become even weaker. And one way this is manifest in terms of political developments is that the Greek state becomes ever more rigid, ever more inflexible, and ever more authoritarian. What, again, Poulantzas had termed authoritarian statism, that because of increasing bureaucratic rigidity, because of the financial limitations of contemporary capitalism, where the state is not able to impose great concessions upon capital any longer, because it is so easily moves, it's so easily to overcome any attempt at state regulations, to secure legitimation, since the Greek state can no longer rely primarily upon the clientelist networks, let's say, or other non-coercive forms of legitimation, it becomes more and more and more coercive, both in terms of its market disciplining tactics, its control of public benefits and so forth, and of course directly with the police, as we've seen many times over the last years, including of course very recently in Greece with these acts of police violence. And if there's any job that has grown in the last 10, 12 years since the beginning of the financial crisis, it is the jobs of the riot police, or police more generally in Greece. That's the one area of growth of employment, within a very dire economic situation. And I would say that paradoxically, even though Greece was always in the margins, as it were, of these historical developments within Greece, much of the time, Greece has gone from being in the margins to being a paradigmatic example of how things are going. That the situation in Greece today is closely being matched by the situation today in the United States, in Britain, in France, and other places. The same limitations on the autonomy of the state, the same limitations on the capacity to control and impose some concessions from capital. The same weaknesses are now being seen not only in the margins, but also in the center of the capitalist global system, and certainly it points to a very dire and bleak political situation today. Thank you very much.
Peter, thank you. Despina, whenever you're ready, let me say a couple of things about your work. Despina Papadimitriou is an associate professor of history at Pantheon University School of Political Sciences. Her research interests include contemporary Greek and European history, ideological analysis, political conservatism, and the far right, conceptual history as well. She's the author of several articles as well and books, including The Interwar Crisis, the Greek Public Debate, published in 2012. Another one with the title From the Law-Abiding People to the Nation of the National-Minded, The Conservative Thought in Greece, 1922-1967. Another title, Notes on the History of the Press, Greek and European Dimensions, this in collaboration with Aristides Baltas, and another one in collaboration with the Mergis, Karapostolis, Armenakis, by the title Cultural Identity and Mass Media of the Hellenic Diaspora. Despina, we are listening.
Thank you very much, Despina, for the invitation. I'm glad to participate in this panel. You hear me, okay?
That's fine.
What was the relationship between the idea of Greek liberty and the Western dream world in the early Cold War? Greece's manifest destiny entered the new temporal horizon that opened up with the Cold War, reinterpreting the assigned role of Greece in the free world. I'll often use historical concepts, those derived from the text, the language of the contemporaries, that you will understand it. Totalitarianism as a concept and a theory contributes to unifying Western political thinking on democracy and its enemies, the state, the party, and civil society. It differs from vulgar versions of the communist conspiracy theory emerging as a rather sophisticated theoretical approach of political phenomena, fascism, Nazism, communism, having their origins in the First World War and their replication in the mind and soul of the individual. But what really makes the difference is that while the nation as a concept is usually implicated in anti-communist and communist discourses, anti-totalitarian thought goes beyond it, expressing often a universal perspective. In April 1950, Marion Dönhoff, the anti-Nazi journalist and later an outspoken advocate of German reunification, argued for freedom rather than unity. She considered it more opportune for Germans to be content with freedom at that conjuncture and to work for unity later. Furthermore, national hubris was associated to the extreme violence of the Third Reich, which gave a racial definition of national identity. In this vein, the mapping out of the new semantic field in the early Cold War years supports the argument that a global approach is more than a matter of the researcher's choice. It is imposed by historical actors' connection to wider ideas, values, and a consciousness of belonging to a global community. The post-war period was also characterized by reassuring belief in the future as the space of hopes and fear, and as Anderson puts it, the idea of a future linked to the idea of humanity as joined together by common destiny. Constellations of friend and foe constituted against the historical horizon of the Second World War were reconfigured by new categories, such as the totalitarian enemy. Greeks who believed in this anti-totalitarian loyalty, the national-minded Greeks, looked back to the past not to select heroic moments, but to identify the itineraries the nation had recently followed in its 9-year struggle, I quote, against the forces of aggression and violence, the Black and the Red Menace. Western European governments in Washington shared their interest in securing Europe against Soviet expansionism towards Europe and Asia, as seen by many Western leaders. They detected a world confrontation of two alternative ways of life in which freedom was everywhere imperiled, as codified in Truman's speech. In another speech, Truman declared, many of these people are confronted with a choice between totalitarianism and democracy. This decision has been forced upon them by the devastation of war, which has so impoverished them that they are easy targets for external pressures and alien ideologies. In fact, concerns over post-war development in Greece were associated with the regional strategy for Western Europe, the Eastern Mediterranean, and the Near East. In 1946, the United Nations Security Council rejected Soviet charges against the British military presence in Greece and the Greek government's policies for endangering peace in the region. In October 1947, United States brought the Greek question before the General Assembly of the United Nations. A special committee on the Balkans was established to investigate the circumstances relating to the Greek Civil War. According to the resolution 193, the continued aid, I quote, given by Albania, Bulgaria, and Yugoslavia to the Greek guerrillas endangered the peace in the Balkans and was inconsistent with the purpose and principle of the Charter of the United Nations. Greek MP Panagiotis Kanellopoulos, ex-Minister of National Defense, in his speech in the plenary session of the United Nations in September 1950, used the concept of totalitarianism. He portrayed Greece as a victorious democracy, which after a hard struggle of 10 years against totalitarianism of every kind and color, has entered into a period of peace and of complete normality and reconstruction. He also raised the issue of the Greek children, I quote, forcibly abducted from their homes and still undergoing the inhuman totalitarian distortion of their soul and spirit. In this context, he linked the supposed de-Hellenization of the evacuated children from their homes in northern Greece to to the theme of totalitarian indoctrination. The fears expressed that the children relocated to the countries of the Eastern Bloc would turn to foes of their families, evoke the image of the recruitment of Christian-born children during the Ottoman rule in Greece. Another, among the most influential notions in the conceptual articulation of totalitarianism was that of the captive mind, which entered the semasiological field of the West with Malraux' book published 2 years after his defection to the West from Poland in 1951. Malraux explicitly emphasized the fact that those who felt attracted by the new faith paid their debt to the old European tradition, exemplified in the wars of religion. It was something more than constrained by material force. Tony Judd wrote that the captive mind is memorable for the pill of multi-being image which Malraux reproduced from an obscure novel by Stanislav Ignacy-Witkiewicz, Insatiability of 1927. In this story, Central Europeans encountering the invasion of unidentified Asiatic hordes swallowed a little pill which relieved them from fear and anxiety, but also made them accept their new rulers, making them happy to receive them. The iconography was a classic metaphor of intellectual enslavement. The Greek liberal novelist Angelos Terzakis discusses the mind of the crown under dictatorship using similar notions, such as that of the expropriated mind. For him, the situations faced by thinking people in France are the same as those faced by those worried about the present and the future in Greece. In his effort to conceptualize the global conscience, he argued that the era of isolationism was over. Issues are therefore global. Without being an essentialist, anyone would agree with Sartre, he said, that a man is a whole world, whether he lives in Paris, in Potsdam, or Vladivostok. Let me move on because the time passes. While cultural categories featured among the most popular themes of Orthodox Christianity, the Orthodox Church's discourse shared the conventions of Western ideology that regarded communism as advocating atheism, the abolition of faith, religion, and family values, recurring themes since the anti-Bolshevism of the 20s. Gratitude was expressed to the great and noble American nation for his assistance in the war against the forces of darkness and on behalf of the preservation of the liberties of the world and Christian civilization. In the synodical admonition against the Banted War, that was the official term to describe the Greek Civil War from 1946 to 1949, the Church of Greece, using the official language of a non-ideological discourse production, posed the risk of an alienation of the people from its spiritual heritage and long-term traditions, as well as of the eradication of the national body. I have to move on again. And I'll talk about the evocation of the classical past as a cultural commonality. It's the last part. Though the image of the Hellenes as the founders of Western civilization derives from another older experience, its articulation in the new space of experience opened up by the Cold War was of crucial importance for the elaboration of the discourse of the nationally minded Greeks and anti-totalitarian discourse in general. For Constantine Tsatsos, Greece was assigned a specific and unique cultural mission, that is the transmission of Greek liberty. Writing after the Battle of Athens, the Kembriana, in December 1944, he used the ancient Greek concept of hubris as synonymous with the violation of the law of measure, which places limits on all human action. Hubris, symmetry, and measure are antithetical to extremism and violence, immanent to the mystical dogmatism of the communists. Transhistorical ideas of Hellenicity as a cultural value and cradle of Western civilization were reappropriated in the context of the Cold War. Drawing on Karner analysis of the palimpsests of the Romantic, I propose that all sentimental encounters with and scholarly investigation of Greek antiquity were rewritten under specific international conditions. The rewriting of Hellenicity puts Greece among the nations to whom a preeminent role was attributed in the so-called Battle of the West against Asian despotism. Beyond the reference to cultural values derived from classical antiquity, political nationalism was transposed into the international system. The Greeks could turn their historical experience, their lived or imagined past and present, into a political reality that also concerned other Western nations. The ideological boundaries of the West at that time were delineated by the lines that separated Soviet culture from, I quote, the idea transmitted from the Greco-Roman tradition and that of the Renaissance. The idea of Greek liberty prevails not only as a long-term structure, but also as a political issue regarding Greece's territorial integrity as a question of security for the Western nations. And I conclude, all in all, moving beyond an approach centered on national history, foreign intervention in Greece, or on post-war exceptional anti-communist politics, I tried to argue for an interplay of all historic actors, big and small nations, US and Greece, in the elaboration of anti-totalitarian discourse and the ideological polarization. It was not only the American manifest destiny, but also Greek mission to fight communist barbarism in favor of the Western ideals of liberty and democracy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Despina. Thank you all for your talks. We have about 15 minutes for a discussion. I have a couple of some questions, comments, and feel free to comment on each other's papers, of course, ideas. I will communicate any questions if they come from our audience here or the audience online. So the way I understand, basically, you're from the outset maybe appearing as sort of like different approaches to the discussion here. I would sum it up as saying that, as I understand, Despina, basically explaining the role of Greece, or here like Hellenism, in this new free world following World War II. Basically, Greece as carrying the torch of anti-totalitarianism, a concept that sort of goes beyond like anti-communism, has like a universalized but also universalizing take on that. And explaining the meeting of nationalist, priori nationalist conservative thought with post-war, again, anti-communism, and Greece sort of serving the new needs of political needs and political dispositions of the West. Then Vassilis' take on Hellenism appears to be sort of another way to used here as a pool of Siloam, in a way, where colonial crimes, such as that of the French army against the Algerian resistance, were washed off, or new business deals, such as that described being brought by Macron, sort of like put in against the symbolic context here of that of Hellenism as well. And of course, Peter's paper, which in his title basically suggests that Greece here being used not as a way of legitimizing the civilizing Western mission prior or after World War II, but sort of functioning as a canary in the mine, being here a paradigm, what you call a concrete universal, describing the Greek crisis and basically sort of like foretelling or announcing what is about to come. I would have another number of questions. Maybe I would start with Vassilis and ask. I mean, as I was reading your paper and like listening to you today, I was thinking about the latest Obama's highly publicized visit of Obama here in Greece after his second term, where he made sure that he was photographed against the backdrop of Acropolis and other side as well. And I wonder, of course, that was at the time that pretty much he wanted to solidify this transatlantic relationship. He made explicit references to NATO. I wonder about the power of those symbolic gestures. I mean, anybody would assume or could say, like, yes, fine. I mean, if you want to discuss or talk about democracy or whatever, it's the most natural or expected thing to do it, like with the Acropolis as a backdrop. But where do you see, or where could we seek like a power of symbolic gestures as such? Do they matter really? Are they as important as maybe some of us think they are? Vassili, if you would like to start the discussion, and I can follow up with more questions. We can hear you.
Appearing before with the Acropolis as appearing on the physical space of the Athenian assembly with the Acropolis as backdrop in the 50s was still powerful. And that's why I mentioned also the first half of the 20th century with the incredible French Hellenophilia. Now, with the passing of time, with the colonial and what used to be called third world movements becoming more important, more influential, changing the terms of the discussion, all the way to the present, to current critiques of the classical and the associations of the classical with colonialism, with Eurocentrism, with patriarchy, and so on. We have a very interesting, say in the second half of the 20th century, if we can put it this way, change of direction, change of vocabulary, change of values, whereby the classical connotations can be negative, can be self-undermining. And then given the situation that, and this is where Vespina's and my presentations converged, and then given the latest experiments with Greece that Peter described, we have an entirely new situation whereby the classical does not have the cultural or financial or political prestige that it used to.
So you would argue that its effectiveness is waning away?
Radically diminished.
I can bring up like more examples. I'm thinking, for instance, about the Democracy Forum, this new institution sort of organizing annual conferences. New York Times is behind it. A number of liberal institutions, international liberal institutions, which, and this goes the direction that you just suggested, invited ultra-conservative like people such as Bannon recently, and made sure, of course, that photographed against the expected background of Acropolis. The whole thing took place in the Agora, ancient Agora. I don't know, I mean, I don't know if anyone would like to add to that. I would think that despite like the possible negative connotations, still like quite evocative. And your argument about Macron, it seems that makes more palatable like economic deals such as the one he brought at the time in Greece. But is any interesting argument, yes, to make that for some audiences at least, this might also have like negative connotations.
Then you have the entire, if I may, Despina, then you have the entire very different reconfiguration of the Hellenic in, for example, the performances of ancient tragedy over the last several years, where staging Medea or Antigone or Phaedra and so on has become very counter-classical, if I can put it this way, in that the protagonists are no longer white or straight or European, and where the tragic dilemmas are staged in very different terms. So a classical realm or body of knowledge and performance like tragedy has been very successfully and very inspiringly reclaimed by other approaches that have nothing to do with the world of Malraux and Macron and Mitsotakis.
Yes, that brings me to the final question, which I will save for 2 minutes later. I would like also to ask whether you think that following this consolidation of liberalism, at the heart of which this discussion about corruption, of course, lies, that Peter introduced in Greece, and more recently, it's neoliberal sensibilities, reaching the point where healthcare is equated with totalitarianism, as Zizek explains, and Peter also mentioned at some point in his paper. Can we talk about a new colonial claims on Hellas? This could be a question for anyone, but if you want Despina or Peter or... Greece most recently has been described as a dead colony. Is this a useful analytical category, or can we stay within an analysis of neoliberalism, imperialism? How would you address the recent development?
I think it's useful on the level of ideology. You know, I think one thing that I'm trying to emphasize is that we, or at least many of us, have indeed accepted the colonial viewpoint that the Greeks have a propensity towards corruption, or they are responsible for the economic problems, sovereign debt, and so forth, that is currently the situation, you know, within the country. So I think there has been very successful. We can talk about a neo-colonial or a new version of the colonial viewpoint, that there are superior and inferior cultures or moralistic tendencies within the world. At the same time, I think it's very misleading to see Greece as a debt colony, or as a colony in the traditional sense, because to the degree that capital has become so transnational, you know, so much occupying the in-between spaces of nation states, that you cannot really point to the poverty, the debt of Greece, and show the wealth of some other part of the world, let's say. That the indebtedness of Greece directly translates into the prosperity of Sweden or Norway or Britain or France and so forth. I mean, in fact, many of these countries also face, to a lesser degree, of course, a problem of sovereign debt or an inability to increase sovereign revenues in order to pay for various social projects. I mean, look to the current situation in the United States, where there was the so-called 3.5 trillion proposed spending plan by Joe Biden and his peoples, which was denounced as very extreme, you know, a very high level of spending. whereas in fact, it would have been about 1.5% of GDP, a very small number, 1.5% of GDP now appears as if it were a huge program. If I remember well from George Bataille, where he talks about the building of the Acropolis was something like 3 or 4 years of GDP of Athens at that time. And now we have 1.5% of GDP, which is, of course, you know, an unthinkably crazy number to, and in part it is, of course, true because the state is very limited in its capacity to tax and raise revenue on capital. But I think for us at least, you know, an important question has to be how to decolonize our perception of Greece and of Greekishness today, so we don't reproduce these colonial viewpoints of propensity towards corruption being that which causes these inequalities. It is very widespread.
Sorry,
widespread.
Peter. Okay, excellent. Yes, this idea about not actually being understood as dead colony is something one could discuss further. It's quite interesting. Despina, anything else you would like to add to this?
Excuse me, Despina, I cannot hear you.
Oh, sorry.
I wonder if Vassilis or Akis could repeat for me
yes,
your question.
Following
Excuse
like this.
me, I don't know, only you, I cannot hear you.
Oh, I'm sorry. So you cannot
no,
hear
it's
me?
not your problem, I don't know, perhaps my internet, I don't know.
Can't hear me at all? Like, I don't know, maybe, okay, Vassili, if you would like to, or Peter, if you would like to repeat the question. I was asking whether there's, following this consolidation of liberalism in Greece and more recently like neoliberal sensibilities, if we can actually talk about new colonial claims on Hellas, or is this a useful analytical category? Should we move towards other ways of trying to understand the situation? No?
Despina,
thank you, Vassilis.
Despina Papadimitriou, did you hear the question?
Not exactly. Could you repeat it for me? About something about colonialism, but could you repeat it for me?
Maybe Despina Papadimitriou.
Or
maybe
can
you have a concluding. Maybe you have a concluding comment or remark to make, since we are running out of time.
Right, we're running out of time. Or maybe I can ask like or something like to think about in the future, where there are any emancipatory possibilities still in this rather conservative term or idea of what we call Hellenism. And here I wanted, of course, to refer to the recent economic crisis and the political developments that came out of it. So if you have any quick comment on that, and we can wrap it up or think about it later.
This is for Peter.
Anyone, but
okay,
and I hope
this is for Peter.
Okay.
If I'm supposed to answer, or Peter?
Or if you can hear us, like, yes, we would be happy to hear from you.
I cannot hear you very well.
Sorry, that's been
let's have Peter giving the answer. Okay.
Sorry.
What was the question again?
Whether there are any emancipatory possibilities, sort of reappropriating this idea of Hellas, Hellenism, or what Greece is. I mean, we came at the verge of like changing the world according to some people's expectations, like a few years ago.
No, I think in Greece the political situation is over. I mean, the failures of Syriza have eliminated, I think, we cannot predict the future.
Right.
You know, this is impossible. But at the present moment, there is no movement of any significance, left movement of significance within Greece. I think this is not. And of course, some notion of Hellas is, I think, also completely untenable as a revolutionary project. Of course, there are ideas. You know, there are germs, as Castoriadis used to say, you know, to help us to think about some of these things. But I don't think it's possible or productive or desirable to create a left a revolutionary project in the name of Hellenism, or in some new version of these ideas.
Okay. Should we leave with that rather negative note, Peter? Okay, thank you all for your... Or Vassili, you have something to add?
No, I...
Yes.
It is as Peter says right now, you cannot work whether within the Greek environment or maybe within the broader humanistic environment. It's very hard to do something emancipatory with Hellenism. At the same time, with the exhaustion of the revolutionary project, it's very hard to think in emancipatory terms anyway, Hellenic or any other. So this is the challenge of our destitute times, to see what can be done with either by, as Brecht would say, refunctioning a repertoire of older terms in a radical way, or simply coming up with a new repertoire.
Right. Thank you all very much, and I hope we have a chance to continue our discussion either within Decolonize Hellas or other venues. Thank you all.
Thank you, Despina. Thank you.
Thank you, Despina. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Vassilis, for all this.
Thanks, everybody.